So eventually, if I could continue, I eventually stopped living in Kobe because I'd met my wife, and her parents were from Hamamatsu. So eventually, I wanted her to come to Kobe, but she said, "Look, if we're gonna get married, then I want to be near my family." And so uh, I moved to Hamamatsu, and we started living together with the intention of getting married. And then I started to get more serious about teaching, and I studied, I furthered my education, and taught in a high school for several years in Hamamatsu, and eventually moved to university.
So, when did you start working at SUAC for?
I started working, so I think it was in when the language center, the English and Chinese language center, the first year that it opened. So I was working part time as a Hijokin teacher at not at here, but at Shizuoka University. I had several coma, so I was a Hijokin teacher, but I think I was teaching 10 coma. And at the time, they had lots of classes for me. Maybe not 10, maybe 8. And so it was almost like a full-time job. And then the SUAC opened the English and Chinese Language Center, and they were looking for native speakers to help out, organizing events, and that sounded really attractive to me. So I applied for the job, and I started working here, and I worked at the language center as a tokenin koshi for 2 years, and then a position opened up for a native speaker here, and I applied for the position, and by some miracle, I was accepted. So that's how I ended up at SUAC. And so I think this is my 6th year as a sending teacher. So yeah, I've been working with Jax, yeah, for I think 7 or 8 years now. Yeah, maybe 8 years. So the center's changed quite a bit. At first, it was just me and one other Japanese English teacher. She's native level English, but she was born in Japan. There was just the two of us, and then in the second year, they hired another English teacher and Ra Sensei, and there's been 4 teachers in the center since then. So yeah, it's changed quite a bit since it first opened, but I think the students are getting a little bit better actually in their English, and some students, the center has really helped people improve their skills. So I think it's been a really important part of this university, to help students kind of develop their useful skills, like not just study English, but use English in a meaningful way. I think that's what the research says, is that's a really important part of learning a second language.
I would agree. That's kind of why I created this.
Yeah. So hopefully people can. So maybe I'll talk about my field. Like I'm really interested in language. Of course, I study Japanese. I study. Of course, I come from a background. My mother was a writer, and my grandfather enjoyed writing too. So I really like literature, and I like writing myself. I'm not as good as my mother or grandfather, but I'm still very interested, and I like good writing, and I like language and learning language. So I my seminar is focused on second language acquisition. So some of the students that join my class are interested in language or in language teaching, to becoming an English teacher. So that's kind of a field that I've become very interested in, how people learn languages and the comparison between how people learn their first language and how people learn a second language and how that relates to language teaching. And maybe I'm concerned as an English teacher in Japan at all levels. I've taught junior high school, and university. I'm sorry, I haven't taught elementary school, but I kind of, there are a few things that could be improved. And so I'm interested in, when I have my seminar students, in discussing ways that the English education in Japan could be improved based on the current research of second language acquisition. Yeah, I think what got me really interested in it was that the TOEIC is a test that a lot of students have to take when they get into university, and a kind of an equivalent test of in Japanese is the Nihongo no Ryoku Shiken. And when I was studying Japanese, my teachers always encouraged me to take this test, and I wasn't any good at it. I don't really concentrate. I don't really have good focus, and I kept trying to take the N1, and I kept failing it. And people say, "Well, your speaking is pretty good, but my listening wasn't as good, and my reading was terrible." And I found that there are certain people that just don't do well at these tests, and I felt that it was really unfair. I think tests like these norm reference tests like TOEIC or the Noryoku Shiken or the Senta Shiken, they're tests of concentration, and I think there are certain people that are good at using language, speaking or writing, but they're not good at kind of just sitting down and writing, taking a test on it. And so that I did more research on that, and I noticed that, of course, there are a lot of students of mine that, in class and the activities, they were really good, but then when I gave them a test, they wouldn't do so well. And, maybe the pressure of the test, or maybe they couldn't focus, or maybe they're just doers. And I find there's a certain number of students like that, and I really wanted to help them improve in their English without being so test focused. And that's why I thought the Language Center was really, really good, because I find that when people use English, they forget about, studying, and it just comes out of them. And there are some people that do very well at that and yet don't do well at these tests. And I kind of feel it's a little fairer, because really what language should be is about use, right? That, even if you get a high score on a test, it's not really real language use, right? It's real language use is using language to for a certain goal. And so that's what the Language Center provides. And that's why I don't want people to judge a Language Center or a language program by a test score. They should judge it by how well people are able to achieve goals based in that language, is what's called, I think, meaningful language use.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel exactly the same. I try to get students to realize that they can English as a tool that you can use to get smarter. Like, use it as a tool to improve yourself. Like, among other things, of course. But like,
Well, I think one of the things we cover in my seminar is, extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation means, I want to get better because I want to speak to people, in and out from other countries in that language. So that's something that, where the motivation is internal, where you have these external goals. For example, I want to get a high score on TOEIC, or I want to pass this test. And they feel that although it can be helpful in the short term, in the long term, in the short term, once you reach those goals, you either have to set new goals or you lose interest. But in the long term, if your goal is, I want to become better at communicating with other people, that's a lifetime goal that never ends. And, I still study, even though I eventually passed the test on my 5th try, and I burned all my textbooks after I passed that Japanese test, the difficult Japanese test, which I regret now, because I wish I had those textbooks to look at sometimes.
Did you really burn them?
I burned them. It was really hard. I took that test 5 times. One time I failed it by 1 point, and then the next time I passed it by 1 point. So, but I think what I'm trying to say is that, the test itself it didn't reflect what I was using, and it was a good short-term goal, but not a good long-term goal. So getting back to my original point, I studied, I still study Japanese every week. After I passed the test, I continue to study Japanese, even though I passed the test, because my motivation is to become more fluent in the language, to be able to read it faster, to be able to communicate people without sounding like a child, to be able to express my personality in the same way in Japanese, in the same way that I can express who I am in English. So those kind of motivational markers are, I think, lifelong goals, right? As opposed to these short-term goals, which can be helpful, but once you pass the test or reach that goal, then what do you do from there? So I think you need both. But again, I think having a goal that's kind of that applies to meaningful language use is when students always ask me, how can I improve in English? How can I study English and improve? The first thing I say, well, look, you know, you just have to work hard. I think there's this illusion that people think that you can, put headphones on and listen to music and suddenly you'll be able to speak English better. And I think it doesn't work like that. I think it requires effort and hard work. And I think then, well, how do you find the motivation to do that? Well, you kind of come up with goals like, I want to communicate with people, or I want to reward myself with a trip if I can do this. I think if you can connect these internal goals with your language use, I think that's a good way to motivate yourself. Because it does take a lot of effort. Think about it. And when you study a second language, at some point, almost every word you learn is consciously learned. So that means you have to remember thousands of words and several different grammatical forms, several meaning a lot of different grammatical forms. And then you have to be able to put it all together. That's a lot of effort, but it's possible if you put the time in. Anybody, I also say to students, you already have proven that you can learn language because you speak Japanese. So there's no reason to say, ego ga nigate, if you do it, you can learn it.
Yeah, definitely. I have similar experiences with learning Japanese. Didn't pass the N1 yet. I haven't even tried N1 yet, but yeah, like initially, right, learning, you think of, like, for example, with words, like when you see just a really simple idea here, but like when you see a dog, like, you see this dog, and if you only speak English, then, or Japanese, you see it as dog. But when you see this concept, this is an animal, and it can be dog, and it can be inu, like that, like this idea that it's a word is not, um,
Yeah, becomes a concept. Yeah. So again, I'm interested the path to learning Japanese, and even now, I still feel there's I still get frustrated studying Japanese. Like, why did I forget that word? I've learned it. Like, think about it. I've been studying Japanese for over 20 years, and I've probably learned certain words like 50 times and forgotten them. And that's just how. And I use that to talk to students about. Don't be so hard on yourself. One of the problems with taking these tests for TOEIC is like, okay, I want to get 600, and then the student gets 600, and they're like, oh, but I wish I got 650. And then if they get 650, they say, oh, but I really wanted 700, and you're never satisfied.
well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you want 600 and then you stop at 600 and then you just quit after that, coast, then
It's not a bad thing, but they're always disappointment. Students are constantly dissatisfied with their level of progress. And what I try to tell them, and I try to tell myself, is you are who you are. You progress at your rate. If you're there, just be there and study. If you're putting the work in, don't worry about your progress. It'll come. Just trust that it'll work, because actually it gets in the way. If you're so concerned about being better, oh, I should have got 700 and I didn't do well and I'm stupid. And if you think these negative things, it's demotivating to do it. But if you think, look, I want to use this in a meaningful way, and if I'm there and I just put the work in and I study, I will get better at language. I think it's a more positive way of doing it, less heartbreaking. And I'm trying to teach people to learn to do what I didn't do, because I was really hard on myself and frustrated, and maybe in too much of a rush to learn.
all right, everyone. Thank you for watching this episode of Kotaku. So let's say thanks to Ted. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much. Take care. Thanks. Bye.
See you.